start. I think we're going to kickstart this. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nasser Al-Tibi. I'm a business news presenter at Al-Arabiya news channel. And of course, the panel today is about the future trends shaping government services. We have instant interpretation and translation. هناك ترجمة فورية باللغة العربية رقم 2 and in French it's channel number 3 for instant interpretation. I'm going to leave a few minutes towards the end of the discussion to open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions or comments, just please take a mental note or jot them down and we'll try to address these at the end. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, Your Excellencies. Dare I say that this session embodies the whole government summit? Well, for one, I'm moderating this session and not any other session. This is a self-serving statement, isn't it? But on a serious note, we can sit here and discuss smart cities, like other panels are discussing. We can sit here and discuss happiness indices and how we come up with that. And we can sit here and even talk about artificial intelligence and what have you. But really, all of these are just facets of what the future holds, not only for government services, but also of what governments themselves will look like in the future. We will try in this panel to shed the light on the future trends shaping government services, the diverse range of public services, and the drivers behind those. And we will try to address how the private sector, and indeed private citizens, how can they interact with all of this, and what roles will they play in the process of public service delivery. So let me start with introducing my esteemed panel. On the far left, not politically, Sean Shine, the Global Managing Director, Health and Public Sector at Accenture. In the middle is Paul Macmillan, the Global Public Sector Industry Leader at Deloitte. And here on my near left is Mr. Dr. Hans-Paul Berkner, the Chairman and the former President and CEO of BCG. So as you well have noticed that it's a panel of consultants, but I can assure you we're not going to give you any PowerPoint presentation today. That's what consultants do, right? No?
Changing.
It's changing, huh? So before we start talking about the future trends and the drivers and delve into that topic, how will governments look like in the future? What is the concept, what is the vision that a government, the government of the future will try to become? So let me pose this question to Hans first. And what is your vision? What is your concept of the government of the future? Go ahead.
Yeah. Actually, there is not one government of the future. I think in different countries, we have very different situations, and the needs of the citizens in different countries are very different, depending on age, demographics. So in Japan, in Europe, we have a very old population. More than half the population are above 50. Here in the Middle East, we have a very, very young population. More than half are less than 25. And so I think it is very important for governments to understand what are the needs of their citizens and to also ask those questions. And only a government that delivers to those needs has legitimacy. And while, of course, we'll later on talk about online and all kinds of technology, I think that the fundamental issue really first is to understand what are the needs. In places like India, obviously also with a very young population, education, schooling is a fundamental need, and the government does not deliver. We see, yes, we see children appearing at school, but teachers are not appearing at school. And so even poor households send their kids to private schools because that's where they get a decent education, whereas in public schools, to a very large extent, they don't. So I think, what I would like to emphasize is for governments to understand what are the needs, schooling, health, housing, but also some basic things like, getting ID cards, maybe getting passports. Then, of course, all the whole issue of social welfare benefits. How are you making sure that the right people get those benefits? And then, of course, the whole issue, citizens are also entrepreneurs, how to ensure that businesses can be built. You get the permissions, you get the rights to operate. And here in the Middle East, you also have a lot of foreign citizens. How do you cater to their needs? How do you make sure that this is a livable place? And ultimately, of course, you also have to measure again and again whether you do meet the needs of your citizens and also all the other participants in society. And so that gets you to hopefully a good feedback loop where then you can really work on those needs and to improve to fulfill those needs. So I would say a good government is the one that really caters to the needs of its citizens and the other participants in society and continuously try to improve on fulfilling those needs, measures it, and over time really improves them.
Mm-hmm. Sean, what is your vision? Can we say the government of the future is small versus large? Can we talk about size? Can we talk about governments being solution enablers rather than problem solvers? What's your vision of the...
Thank you, Nasser. And first, can I say I'm delighted to be here. It's wonderful to be in Dubai and have the privilege of speaking to you. Let me start at a different point. If you think about it today, there are 4.5 billion people on the internet and have mobile phone access, and yet 3.5 billion people have toothbrushes. Or look at it another way. There are more people online today than have access to refrigeration. So when you stop and look, and I think it's been coming out in the themes of a lot of the conversations over the last 3 days, it is clear to me that digital government, or whatever we want to call it, is becoming a core part of what we do, irrespective of the particular segment of population, whether they be young, whether they be growing, whether the country is developing, whether the country is already fully developed. I think the reality is that digital is going to have a profound impact. And so if you take that then from a government perspective, clearly, and we've seen this over the last number of days, we need to have connected or involved citizens. We need to have a collaborative government system. Government needs to be a disruptor. Successful countries and successful governments are challenging the ways in which things are done and changing the ways in which things are done. They need to create an entrepreneurial environment. And we talk about the digital intensity. Countries that are digital are more successful and their GDP grows. The government needs to be more open, which comes with difficulty in a lot of the more traditional countries, if I can say that. And of course, underlying that then, there needs to be the infrastructure. And I'll use some terms. Yes, it does need to be always on. Yes, it does need to be secure. There needs to be confidence around privacy. And one piece of data, 93% of the citizens in the UAE believe that trust and confidence in government will increase if the digital services increase.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Paul, so government should be a disruptor of the status quo in order to challenge this innovation or innovative approach to governing?
Maybe. I've been puzzling for some time as to the future, what the future government looks like. We issued a report here today, as did our colleagues, relative to looking at government trends. My colleague and I, Bill Eggers, wrote a book a couple years back. We called it The Solution Revolution. And what we were doing was we were looking at the non-government players who have an interest in improving social outcomes, of which there are many. But we did that because we wanted to bring those observations back to our government clients and say, you know, this ecosystem of players, which we called the solution economy, we think that that could be leveraged. And then we did the Gov 2020 report that's been released here today. A couple things about, first of all, I don't know what the future government's going to be like, and you know, because of the nature of change. I think the what we've seen here in the last 2 days, I mean, I've been updating my notes over the course of the day, 2 days, to think about what we could talk about here today that might be different in terms of some of the trends. The thing that caught my attention was the Watson presentation. I hadn't seen that before. And I'll tell you why it caught my attention, not because it has 3,500 books in it and the like, but because this concept of an adaptive system, a cognitive system that adapts and learns. And so one of the things that I was thinking about was, shouldn't government be an adaptive system? Because one of the things that we've been thinking about is, how do government leaders connect with all of this change? And it's only going to happen from a perspective of this kind of learning, and I don't want to say just a learning organization, because that sounds kind of, you know, it's already been written about. And I just want one more, I think there's three characteristics of what an adaptive government will look like. Now, is it okay if I go into those now, or do you want me to stop, pause there?
No, go ahead. But just put the mic next to...
Okay, sorry. There's three characteristics of the... one is what I call open functionality. And so what we mean by that is moving from open government and open data into, as was mentioned, crowdsourcing, co-production, these types of ideas. And so the presentation that you just saw with respect to Kent Larson around all the changes that are happening in transportation and mobility. The second feature I think that will be important to government in the future is applied learning. And so what we mean by that is the ability to look at these innovations and figure out how to apply them. And whether it be data, whether it be digital, whether it be whatever the topic is, we've seen everything from robotics to drones to you name it. So the question is, how can governments begin to apply that in a practical way and develop insights both on how that improves service, but also on the process of change? And then the third piece is what I would refer to as adaptive rulemaking. And so what I mean by that is, you know, Kent Larson is an architect, and he would tell you in terms of some of his experiences, because he and I have chatted about this, he can come up with the great models for City of the Future, but the zoning ordinances and the bylaws and the rules that exist with respect to setbacks from the street, density of houses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are going to stand in the way of realizing those innovations. So somehow government of the future has to be better at adapting rules to accommodate these innovations. So I would say there's three things: more open functionality, applying learning with respect to these innovations, and adapting rules such that innovation can scale.
May I add one point? You know, of course, it sounds like ultimately the government will provide for everything, everywhere, for everybody. But I think in a time, and you also talked about this massive change, I think it's also important that government is demanding and challenging its citizens. You know, I think, of course, you know, we want people to be well educated, but we also should demand that they really put effort into school. We want, of course, great healthcare, but we also need to make sure that people do ideally not spoil their own health with alcohol, tobacco, too much sugar, fat, etc., etc. And so I think it is also quite important to think about how can the government, you know, bring those challenges across to the citizen without becoming overpowering and becoming therapeutic and therefore dictatorial.
So how to enable the citizen to play a bigger role in that?
Enabling sounds
the
like a
process
very
of,
nice word, yes.
Nice, yeah? I'm using your jargon. So.
No, that's true. You're absolutely right. I think we
Right.
would have also said enabling, right?
Okay. So, Paul, very interesting that you're the one who said, you know, the future of government, we can't really pinpoint what it is because of the trends that are taking place right now that keeps that question an open-ended question because of that nature of the changes and transformations that were taking place at the moment. But let us now touch upon the key trends and the key drivers. At least let's start with the drivers and what kind of trends that they will produce over the next decade or so. So, Sean, if you can...
Yeah, I think first off, demography, and it's been talked about already. You know, by 2050, the number of people that are over 60 years of age in the world will double. So people are getting older. That's going to put pressure on healthcare systems. It's going to put pressure on pensions. It's going to put pressure on dependency in terms of the amount of people working, supporting the rest of the population. So big shifts that haven't really been resolved in the past. I think productivity. We've seen the dilemma over the past 10 years with all this wonderful technology and all this great new stuff, and yet productivity has increased by less than 1% every year.
Yeah.
Flat, or maybe a little bit better at best, but it's, you know, it's very, very low. I think there's a resource decline. The reality is, in most governments around the world, that spending will be reduced. Current research says that over the next 5 years, governments will reduce spending by around 2.1% of GDP per year. So there will be less resources to deliver more services. And finally, as I've talked about already, the technology change, that profound shift that's happening, which is also driving the demands of us as customers of government. Each of us are getting accustomed to dealing with banks, with insurance companies, with airlines. You know, I used to ask people in audiences like this in the past, how many people have a mobile phone? I don't bother asking anymore. Perhaps the question now, how many people have more than one mobile phone? You know, how many people have seen a paper airline ticket in the last 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? You know, 11% of the world's population are on Facebook. In the last minute while I've been speaking, 140,000 tweets have been sent. The world is changing dramatically, and business processes are changing. And we can see it happening in the private sector, where businesses are changing. They interact with customers, the manner in which they interact. They're changing the way they're delivering services. And that's the context that we look in terms of governing.
Paul, you've mentioned some of the trends, or you've touched upon that in your previous answer. But let's talk about the drivers. And when we're talking about the drivers, the cross-sectional drivers across all domains of government services.
Well, I'll tell you, when we looked at this solution economy to figure out what was happening with the people who were not government people, philanthropists, smart people with smartphones, social media players, citizen activists, etc., and what they were trying to do. So you pick any domain you want to pick: education, healthcare, transit, etc. A couple characteristics that I think are important to reflect upon. First is they didn't ask government's permission to get involved in these sectors, right? And the reason we called it the solution economy was because they were focused on solving problems. Potholes on the street, ride sharing, commute times, whatever it might be. So what was very interesting was what we tried to understand was what is happening in that space that might be of relevance to government. So the first is, first is this concept of an ecosystem or a marketplace for social good. And one of the things that we think is very important is to think about who these, we call them wave makers. Who are these people who have an interest in social good or organizations that government could be leveraging? So for example, the Waze application, which has been created so that people can basically navigate transportation routes, all crowdsourced, right? They didn't ask government permission to do that. They just saw a market need and went off and did that. But that capability could be very important to transit planning in the future. And so there's the wave makers, Then there's this, lightweight technology through smartphones and cloud, and that's really enabling a lot of innovation to take place. This sort of disruptive innovation. And there's a type of exchange. Impact investment is growing in terms of social finance, but the exchange is based on data, it's based on company and individual reputation, it's based on citizen time, citizens just volunteering time to help solve problems. And so in that marketplace is an exchange. Some of them are like two-sided markets, ride sharing, et cetera. And so these phenomena are very important because government's ability to engage with that marketplace is going to be very important. Now, at one point, we call it solution recruitment, because we kind of thought, well, government can recruit people to sort of say, hey, you came up with a good application for online learning or for videos for education or what have you. We want to incorporate that in our curriculum. And we think it's very important that, I've seen these trends where you look at, is government thinking, are they, YouTube videos in classrooms. Many countries around the world, my own included, you can look at that and you can say, so what is the perspective of public education in that? They kind of go from resisting, right, to tolerating, maybe accepting, and then finally embracing. Right? And so we're looking for governments to find ways to embrace these innovations sooner in how they unfold.
Hans, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think with all due respect, I think what you're describing are the marginal fringes of what is going on. Yeah, maybe that will become more important, but if I think of the GCC countries, if I think of Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, and so forth, even Latin America, what you have are a very, very big spending of governments. I mean, you may know that half of the whole social welfare benefits in the world are being paid in Europe, which is less than 7% of the world population. And this is what people associate with government services and government. And they expect those services. And the spending and the benefits, and I think that's to a very large extent also true here in the GCC, where lots of services are provided at no cost or for very little cost. And so I think one of the key issues, besides the online, the technology, the private initiatives, I think will be for government to really be able to provide services and benefits, but much more targeted, and maybe also to reduce the spending. I think the crisis, financial crisis in Europe, North America, Japan, but also I think now the drop in the oil price here is a great opportunity for governments to become much more economical in what it does, to be much more impactful. And it means, you have to be a lot more focused and segmented in your approach, not to give everybody the same issues. Why are we giving big subsidies on energy or water for the rich and the poor? And it's not just here. It's in Nigeria. It was in Indonesia, in India, and so forth. And actually, it's the rich who are benefiting from those much more than the poor, who very often didn't have any car whatsoever. So why are they demonstrating again, cutting the subsidies? Anyway, so I think one of the key elements will be for the governments to become much more focused, much in what service to provide for whom. And therefore, I think really saving and being much more economically, especially when the resources or the expenditures have to be limited or even reduced.
So Hans, you're saying we should go back to the basics, streamline the expenditures before even talking about what technology could...
Let me give you one example. I mean, we worked, as the Boston Consortium, we worked helping the Australian government to combine all the social welfare benefit programs. And there were more than a dozen different programs. Some people got several benefits, on top of each other. Others were left out. And I think really combining those, of course you can talk about one-stop shopping, but also making sure that it's really targeted. People who have certain needs get certain benefits, and others who don't have those don't get them. And so really making sure that you achieve a lot more impact even with spending less. And I think that will be a key issue not just for Australia. It will be a key issue for many governments around the world, and also increasingly in places like China, where we also have the demographic issue and where we have healthcare, pension liabilities, and many other benefits creeping up and expanding massively as the population changes.
Sean, Hans is putting his finger on a very important issue, which is the issue of doing more for less for government, especially at this time when we have, resources are limited. We have austerity abound all over the world, especially in Europe. There are gaping budget deficits everywhere. This is the norm now for most governments, and even here in the GCC, where oil revenues are shrinking because of the decline in oil prices. How can we really make governments do more for less and become more efficient?
Thanks, Nasser. First, I think about it as doing better for less. Because I think we've talked about it for a long time, but I'm really concerned that many governments don't seem to get it, that actually there is a real shift. There's an urgency to this. If you look at the income side, it's coming down. If you look at the demand side, it's going up. And you can't bring those together. And the expectations that Hans has talked about are rising everywhere, plus the demographics. So there absolutely has to be a focus. The sort of programs that Hans talked about in Australia, that have been done in the UK with universal credit or in various other countries. It's first, let's figure out the art of the possible and where we're going. Then let's figure out how to execute it. One of my big worries at the moment, I know of one country that when they talk about digital government and e-government, their focus is on document management. I hesitate to use the term, but there's a danger that they will automate what's already there and perhaps have the same mess for less. It's a real concern. We have to challenge the manner in which things are done. I've talked about the service requirements and the customer requirements. You and I just expect more. We expect it faster. And we expect to get it in the same way or better than the private sector can deliver. But that demand is rising. And yet many governments are saying, well, hopefully this crisis will go away. The debt crisis was one in Europe, the property bubble in various countries, the oil price. But let's face it, this is the new normal. The demands are not going to go away. So there has to be a clear vision as to where we're going in government. And then I think the ability and the confidence to execute. I think how often have we seen a good idea or a good vision, which I think is often very easy to put together. There's lots of ideas. But the difference between the vision and executing it successfully is a big, big difference. And when I look at the execution capability of many governments, I think we need to focus more there to be able to really drive through that. And I go back to it, I say, yes, absolutely, the prize is very big. And just again, I'll repeat, look at what the private sector has done. And remember, the private sector isn't always the best thing. There's been lots of errors and mistakes in the private sector.
Of course.
But when we see the degree of change that's happening in business models and in the way in which business and services are delivered in the private sector, with that relentless focus on cost reduction at the same time as that focus on service improvement, I think that's what we've got to aspire to in government.
Paul, I saw you taking notes there.
Notes
so how can we connect the vision and the execution? So probably doing more for less or doing more for better, as Sean has put it. It's all about efficiency and the execution.
Yeah, and there's a lot of really good things happening with respect to, we talk broadly about big data, and one of my colleagues recently wrote an article in the Deloitte Review, which is our sort of management journal, which just came out. He called it The Last Mile. And what he is looking at is the relationship between big data and analytics and behavior change. Because in the social services space, if you take that as an example, the growth in payment, let's face it, for many governments around the world, the outcomes that they achieve in areas of social assistance are not good. Most people who are on unemployment stay on unemployment, or if they get off of it, go back on it. There's chronic issues with respect to social needs. And so what we have found is that there's a bit of a triangle of capabilities that are becoming more important. The first is what we would call the surveillance activity, and that is, where is the data coming from for you to diagnose and assess the issues? And that needs to come both from your transactional systems across programs, as well as from crowdsource-based information. So doctors reporting childhood injuries, or private companies reporting childhood accidents or injuries, and other sources of information on why children have accidents would be a surveillance function. The second function is like the risk modeling or risk management function. And so what that relates to is applying an analytics framework to sort of say, why do these things happen? And can we try to predict and understand the dynamics of how they happen? So you have a surveillance type function and a risk modeling type function. And then the third one, which is most interesting, is this behavioral economics nudge stuff that's starting to emerge within government speak. And what that is really trying to get at is, you know, even if I can get data on a problem and I can model where I think the next accident is going to happen, I can communicate that to a mother, for example, or a father. Your child should wear a helmet on a bicycle. That doesn't mean they're going to change their behavior. So even if I have the greatest data science around what the problem is and why it occurs, how that gets communicated to citizens is very important. And that communications aspect is one that requires trial and error. And so that's why when I talked about, you know, applied learning, the ability to iterate that, which gets you into things like lean methodologies and agile and this kind of stuff. And it's becoming, and just one other observation on that, that communications function is really being fed by the digital piece. Because what we're really talking about is moving that information into consumable pieces. And that's often finding itself onto mobile services. But the analysis of whether or not behavior is actually changing, are people finding jobs, are they getting good housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is that last mile. And so I would say that it will get more sophisticated, in that respect, and those are all things that are on the program spend. You know, we're not talking about back office things here, we're talking about the mainline expenditures of government. And so the return on investment in working in that area is very important.
Hans, so Paul is talking about mining this big data, analyzing it, and the challenge of communicating this, executing all this process to satisfy the demand that Sean is saying is going to continue to increase in the future.
Well, obviously, I mean, there are opportunities there. There's no question about it. But again, I'm not sure whether it will really ultimately, get to this, get the government to the next level. I think one of the things that we also discussed up front was, the role of private initiative, and you both mentioned that before. And I think, usually you improve services through competition. And I think an increasing element, like in healthcare, like in education, other services, I think could very well be in opening up services, public services, to competition, and then therefore really making sure that better offerings are putting pressure on those who with poor offerings, and therefore also making the governments change, because I think change requires two: the ones who make the service offering, but also those who are receiving offerings. Now, people in Europe, and I guess people in the GCC, are quite satisfied with what they get, because they get a lot. And so why should they change? There is enormous resistance to change. You mentioned austerity. We haven't done so much austerity in Europe, with all due respect. I don't see any austerity.
Maybe the Greeks might disagree with you. They sure have in the last elections.
Yes, they do disagree, that's true. But I mean, this is a very small part of Europe, so let's not get into that. It's I think the key element is for people want to keep what they have. At the same time, I think we all know that government expenditures have to be limited in one way or the other. And I think, therefore, how can we deliver on the key services and the basic services, not just, more, which is probably not possible, but better. And I think one of the key elements will be to make sure that there is competition, there's openness, will get more opportunities for people to engage and provide those services. I think education, in a number of parts of the world, private education has demonstrated that it can provide much better quality, even for less. Healthcare, I think competition is a key element. And so I think, when we always think about, making the best use of the latest technology, and I'm sure it will help. But in many places, in many countries, I think this is not the real issue. The real issue is, the basic offering and the demand of the citizens. And they are, demands are going up all the time, and we need to be able to address those issues, but also make sure that people understand that there is a limit to what they can expect. Otherwise, governments will always be behind and always trying to provide more and more and more. And I think, having, different services, competing services, I think is one way of addressing the issue, and putting also more pressure on everybody, on the one hand to provide better services, but on the other hand also for citizens to understand that there is no free for all. I think it's very important to limit your needs also to what you actually do need.
So Sean, better, not more, but maybe to satisfying the demand that you talked about, probably Hans is saying, let's try to control the expectations, or set the expectations right.
And I think we've got to be clever and thoughtful about how we do it. Let me just go back a bit and talk about big data. Because everybody hears the term big data. There will be 4.8 billion searches on Google today, just in one day, 4.8 billion. Google can tell in advance where flu is going to happen and the occurrence of flu epidemics by the nature of searches that are happening. So it's really shifting. And the other data that really surprised me, I guess some of you in this room were around before 1980, but in 1980, a gigabyte of data cost $400,000. Today, that same gigabyte costs 5 cents. So the availability of the technology and the storage medium. And then you say, well, so what? Big deal. Well, let's look from a healthcare perspective. I think something that affects us all. In the world today, there are 390 million people that have diabetes. In the US this year, they will spend about $245 billion on managing diabetes. So this is a big issue, and it's increasing.
It's a big issue as well here in the Gulf.
Absolutely, everywhere. And so then you look at using predictive data to manage chronic diseases. We've done some work with a client in Spain where they're spending more than 80% of their entire healthcare budget on less than 20% of the population. And of course, it's the people with the chronic diseases. If you have diabetes, you're more likely to get heart disease. If you have heart disease and diabetes, you're more likely to get, and the complications just build up. And that consumes a huge volume of the healthcare budget in any country. Using predictive data, you can begin to identify who among us in this room have a heightened risk of getting those diseases in future years. And also by doing behavioral changes, perhaps if I were to run more, perhaps if I were to change my diet, perhaps if I started that 10 or 20 years ahead of time, that could ultimately reduce the spend for the country, which makes a profound difference. And I will say in the last few days, I was just in Abu Dhabi with the Cleveland Clinic in Abu Dhabi, which will go live in the next 4 to 6 months. And it is truly amazing to see how all the technological pieces come together with the biomedical devices and the best caregivers to come together to really deliver better outcomes from a healthcare perspective. So in my mind, I think these bigger theories and concepts that we talk about, like big data, have a real sharp end. I won't even get into talking about tax or in social security fraud, whereby you can predict automatically, you can tell in advance who are the people who are likely to evade tax. And if you know that in advance, you can work with them closer to keep them outside of that. Because, you know, most taxpayers, apart from a very small percentage, actually want to pay tax. But they fall into bad habits and their cash flow goes bad, and before they know it, they've not paid this, and then the bigger problem. So using that sort of predictive analytics based on big data makes a real difference and can have a profound impact on delivery of government services.
Paul, what are other applications of mining the big data in terms of analyzing and predicting?
There's lots. We could, the most important thing about that, and then I want to make another comment, but the most important thing about the data piece is getting your hands on some data and doing some complex analysis. That's basically it. You know, we've spent quite a bit of time doing what we call executive education programs for government leaders on the topic of advanced analytics. And the selfish reason why we did that was because, of course, we can only do for governments what gets put into a request for proposal. And so, you know, selfishly, our approach has been to say, you know, how about if we do some things with data that you have so you can begin to say, okay, what's different about this? And there's a lot that's different about it. There's no question about it. And the learning in that environment is substantial. And so the big thing about it is, you know, you got to get your hands dirty with the data. And the thing that I would say about that is, in parallel with that, because I want to talk a little bit about sort of capability building, in parallel with that, you're looking at how to build capabilities with respect to everything from data governance to information management frameworks to privacy tools to et cetera. It's very important in this day and age to begin to extract data out of systems and begin to model and using advanced tools earlier in your capability process than you would have historically done. Because historically, you know, you'd be on a 24-month journey of information systems implementation before you got to an insight. Now you can get to the insight sooner, and you can use that insight to help you design what it is you want with respect to information management and other capabilities. So that's just on the data piece. But the other thing that I thought was important, I meant to mention in the earlier piece, was we just released a survey that we did of government executives. And it just so happens that the UAE government executives were a big contributor to that survey. There were about 1,500 responses across the UAE, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And the thing that I found most interesting about that is the #1 priority for government leaders is what it was referred to as building leadership capacity. And the #2 was driving change management. And increasingly, the reason I raise that now is because, I mean, you can't go through 2.5 days of what has been happening here without knowing that the world outside is changing faster than the world inside, right? And the old Jack Welch GE expression was, you know, when the world outside is changing faster than the world inside, that the end is near, kind of thing. That doesn't necessarily apply in a government context, but from a credibility perspective and an outcome perspective, it's relevant. And so I think that the adoption of these innovations is the big challenge for government. It's not the absence of technological advances, it's how the organization will adopt those advances and then adapt its behavior going forward.
Yeah. Again, I would, I think, urge all of us also to really think about some of the basics. You rightly emphasized the importance of change management and the willingness of governments and its ability to really drive change. I think many of the laws, many of the regulations are ill-conceived and badly executed. And there are loopholes in taxation, there are loopholes in subsidies, benefits, and people benefit from those in various ways, you know, corporations, individuals, and so forth. And I think one of the key elements will be to address those things and to address, benefits to people who don't deserve them, to close tax loopholes and so forth. And I think you don't have to forecast those who will avoid taxes. I mean, people, I think in general, try to do that. I think what you need is to really collect taxes. And when you talk about Greece, they only collect about 50% of the taxes that they have decreed by law themselves, you know, the parliaments. So I think that many of the things need basic stuff, and I think the governments have, and I think, you know, I think Paul is really right in emphasizing the ability for change management, the ability to execute. And I think the government of the future, hopefully will be one that has the willingness to make the changes that they see, and the governments of the future will have the ability to execute on those things. We see that people, need to work longer because, lifespans will be much longer. There is massive resistance, I would say, everywhere in the world for people to work longer, even though I think it's quite obvious that, dependency ratios have become much higher, and we need to address that. And I think that will be the key issue. And again, big data, analytics, I think we should use them, absolutely. But the fundamental improvements in terms of government's capability to have impact will, be only marginally affected unless they address the basics. And I think, that really makes the difference between good governments and not so good governments. And hopefully the future governments in the future will be better in dealing with those issues, making the change happen, and then executing on it.
Longer working hours, I don't think you're going to win any friends in France, at least.
That's exactly what it is. But I mean, if people on average become 80 and 85 and then 90, you cannot stop working at 60 or 58 or even earlier. The same issue here is in the GCC. I think you have to address that. And that will drive massive changes in behavior of people. That's what the governments have to engage with their citizens on. And then, of course, it helps to have big data and to have the issues and so forth and to understand what drives certain things. But that's I would say, the icing on the cake at the moment, as long as we are not willing to address some of the fundamental issues driven by demographics, driven by the issue for better education, training for people so that they really are able to engage in an environment which has much more demands on them as workers, as employers, as entrepreneurs.
So maybe we're starting in some regions from a low base, so we need to address the fundamentals before going into more sophisticated...
the fundamentals, are important everywhere. I think the more sophisticated things are also helpful, but I think the key element really is to address the key issues in societies all over the world. And it's not just something, in Europe or North America, it's also here in the GCC, and it will happen very quickly also in China, where the working class population is already starting to decline.
Well, I want to touch upon one thing. We've talked about the trends, the drivers, we've discussed that. But one thing, Hans, you touched upon was the private sector, and we said we wanted to talk about the private sector and its role in all of this. It's a major stakeholder in this change. How can the private sector, Sean, collaborate with government in order to face those challenges that we're talking about?
First, I would say it's a must. If you look at typical European governments, the government is perhaps 40 to 50% of most economies. So it's a big
57 in the case of France.
There you go. So but it's significant. However, when you see changes that are happening, and I've talked about them already, the private sector is driving a lot of change. But in fact, government creates the environment for that private sector to flourish. And the successful countries are ones that have that continuum, that virtuous circle, where they're creating regulation where private business can flourish and where that innovation can go back into government. And so that virtuous circle is created. And you are all aware of examples around the world where that's working very well. I think then what needs to happen is that there needs to be various partnership models. We were laughing beforehand, that terrible term, the public-private partnership, or what many governments have tried to do, which is to take risk and give it to the private sector. And let's face it, there are certain risks that government take on that the private sector just cannot do. The private sector cannot replace the function of government. So there has to be a sensible balance and a mature balance of risk and reward between the public and private sector. And if that can be created, then that can drive a lot of innovation in the public sector. What I've seen in many European countries is whereby there's such a nervousness about failure or of big initiatives going bad, they create a terribly complex contractual framework. I have to say the lawyers do very well out of it on both sides, but the citizens don't and the private sector don't. And so I think we need to really challenge ourselves to say, how can we collaborate more? How can we create that mindset to innovate fast, do things fast, get away from this mindset that says it must be perfect on day one, get this view that says, here's our vision, We're going to go to it like steps of stairs. I don't know precisely what I'm going to do in 2 years' time, but I have a rough idea where I'm going, and that can foster innovation as well. So I think the mindset of government also needs to shift in terms of procurement and being able to have that partnership, and whereby small failures can be fixed fast. And of course, we all learn from failures. And if you look at some of the most successful initiatives around the world that governments are driving, in some cases the first steps were faltering. They learned fast, they changed, they got the right partners with the right mix of execution skill and visionary skill, and they got on with it. So I think there has to be that shift, and I have to say I've seen many situations where there's been more failure than success from that perspective.
Paul, in a minute or two, how should the private sector assume a role in the nascent solution market for public services?
Well, I don't think it can be dictated. It's not being dictated today. Uber didn't ask for permission to get into the public transit business and put a bunch of taxis out of business. Governments tried to figure out how to regulate that, and they're stumbling around with it because the business model is so different that they've had to kind of come to terms with it. So I don't think you can dictate what role private sector is going to play, holistically, broadly speaking, because it's playing roles with or without your permission, and it's going to continue. The question is, how do you embrace it and adjust and adapt to enable it? And so it's getting very difficult now to draw the line between, you know, what's a public service and what's a private service. When we looked for the distinguishing feature between the people in that space, the private sector people in that space, we thought it was going to be companies that were prepared to take a lower profit in exchange for doing a public good. And that was not the distinguishing feature. The distinguishing feature was organizations that saw a problem and were trying to solve it. Some of them are making a lot of money doing it, and others are doing it as a social enterprise. But if you look for that distinction, you're going to miss a lot about what's happening in that space.
Okay. We don't have much time, but I just want to, before we open the floor to questions, I just want to discuss one more point. A very much used solution, and we've touched upon that, Hans, you've talked about it. Many governments around the world are providing the one-stop shop service centers to their citizens to come up with synergies. How efficient really are these centers? We've seen them work for the most part on the front end of providing those services, but sometimes and in certain instances at the back end, we didn't, or the results were vague or sometimes negative, for example, in terms of procurement. So how successful were these?
Well, I think if you cluster, I think things that belong together and where the same group within the population looks for a bunch or bunch of services, I think then it makes a lot of sense both on the front and the back end. But if you try to put things together, let's say, you know, one big IT platform for everything, then I think you will get into trouble because these become endless projects, and therefore I think it really makes sense to have one-stop shopping where actually the needs are the same, and actually also where the processing really makes sense, you know, on the back end. But if you try to bunch things together which actually don't belong, and you just think, you know, okay, we have one big solution for everything, then I think you will certainly fail.
Sean, what's your 5 cents on that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think this view that says one size fits all, one-stop shop, great if you can do it, but if I'm paying motor tax once a year, and if I'm paying value-added tax 12 times a year, there really is no interaction between those transactions. There is no benefit to me as a user to have the same portal. So this idea that said we should have everything in the same portal, build it and they will come, personally I disagree with that. And I focus more on the individual transactions and the grouping that Paul talks about and trying to make those more efficient. If all of that is done, then great if you can also group them together, but the benefit is very small. And I've seen, again, many initiatives where they start with that concept to say one size fits all is wonderful. I don't think so. In the right place, yes.
Paul?
There's efficiencies in some functions. I think that's been demonstrated, and I don't think it can be a fundamental. I would certainly encourage it to be explored, but it's incremental in terms of its impact.